Hi, I'm Jane from Poppy Patchwork, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to make a 9-inch Salem Star quilt block. You can use this quilt block to make a quilt, and here are 3 different options. The first one is the quilt block repeated. The second one is the same quilt block but with sashings and cornerstones. And the third option is the quilt block placed on point. So I've drawn it out in my quilt block notebook so that I can work out what size of fabrics to cut. To make the Salem Star 9-inch quilt block, you're going to need in background fabric 8 2-inch squares, 4 2 3/4 inch squares, 1 3.5-inch square, 1 4 3/4 inch square, and 4 2 3/4 inch squares. In fabric A, you're going to need 4 2 3/4 inch squares, and in fabric B, you're going to need 4 2-inch squares, 1 4 3/4 inch squares, and 4 2 3/4 inch squares. We're going to begin by making the half square triangles, and for this you're going to need the 3 1/4 inch squares in background fabric and fabric A. So I'm going to have 4 of fabric A in a 3 1/4 inch squares, and I'm going to need 4 of them in the background squares. So I'm going to start by drawing a diagonal line on the wrong side of the background fabric squares. And to do this, I start by drawing a line in the centre and then out to the corners, just to stop the fabric dragging too much. And now I'm going to pin these right sides together. So I'm going to take those to the sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam on both sides of the drawn line. I'm going to remove the pins and then I'm going to cut along the drawn line. I'm just checking my plan, so I need to trim these to 2 inches. So I'm going to show you 2 ways of doing that. The first way is with the standard quilting ruler. And for this, I'm going to press the seams to one side. So I'm going to set the seam and then press the seams towards the darker fabric. So these are a little bit big, but what you will need to do is trim them to 2 inches. So I'm going to line my 45-degree line on the ruler along the seam line, and then I'm going to make sure that I've got just a bit more than 2 inches running along the bottom and the side edges, and then I'm going to cut up one side and across the top. I'm then going to rotate this around, and again lining that 45-degree line on the seam line, I'm going to line the 2 inches on the bottom and the left side exactly, and then I'm going to trim up one side and along the top. Now I prefer to use the Quilt in a Day 6.5-inch triangle square up ruler, and for this you leave your piece unpressed and folded, and then you line the 2-inch mark on the ruler along your stitch line, and then you trim up one side and down the other side. So I'm going to do that with the rest of my pieces. So now I'm going to press all of those pieces. So I'm going to set the seam and press towards the darker fabric. And then once I've done all that, I will cut the dog ears off. To make the flying geese, we're going to do the 4 at a time method, and for this you're going to need 2 large squares and 4 small squares. And in the block, the flying squares have both a background point and a fabric bead point, which is why we have squares in different fabrics. So we're going to start by drawing a diagonal line on the wrong side of the small fabric squares. So I'm going to start with the background fabric, the large square in the background fabric, and I'm going to pin a small square in fabric B in the corner. And then I'm going to pin another one in the opposite corner. And what you need to make sure is the drawn line runs from corner to corner. Now I'm going to repeat that with the fabric B large square and the small background fabrics. So again, right sides together, placing one in the corner, and then another one in the opposite corner, with that drawn line running from corner to corner. I'm going to take these to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam on both sides of the drawn line. So I'm going to remove the pins, and then I'm going to cut along the drawn line. And now I'm going to press the seams. So I'm going to set the seams, and then I'm going to press towards the small triangles. And now I'm going to place a small square in the corner of the piece we've just sewn, so that the line that we've drawn intersects these two triangles. You need to make sure that you use the correct fabric when you're doing this. Okay, so I'm going to take those over to the sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam on both sides of the drawn line. So I'm going to remove the pins and cut along the drawn line. And now I'm going to press towards the triangles. So now I'm going to trim these using the Creative Grids Ultimate Flying Geese tool. Now if you don't have one of these, then click on the link above and it will take you to my video on how to trim flying geese with a standard ruler. You need to trim your piece so that it is 2 inches by 3.5 inches, so that when they're sewn into the block they measure 1.5 by 3 inches. So on this tool we need to be trimming to the C lines. So with this tool you do trim number 1, which is lining up the apex of your triangle on the C points, and then trimming down one side and along the top. You then need to rotate the unit and the ruler, and again for trim 2 you need to line the apex of the triangle on the lines on the ruler, and then you need to trim down one side and along the top. So I'm going to repeat that with all my flying geese. So to make the corner square piece for the centre of the block, you need the 3.5 inch centre square piece here in background fabric and the 2 inch squares in fabric C. We're going to draw a diagonal line on the wrong side of the 2-inch squares. And we're going to pin one of these in the corner of your background fabric. You need to make sure that it lines up really well with the corner of the background fabric, and the diagonal line needs to run from here to here. And then I'm going to place another piece in the opposite corner, the diagonal line running in the same direction. Now I'm going to take that over to the sewing machine, and this time I'm going to sew on top of the drawn line. I'm going to remove the pins, and this time I'm going to line the ruler with the 1/4 inch line on the ruler on top of the seam I've just sewn, and then I'm going to cut a 1/4 inch away from that line. I'm going to do that on both sides. And now I'm going to press the unit. So I'm going to set the seams and then press them towards those small triangle pieces. And now I'm going to pin the other 2 corner pieces, the other 2 squares in the corners. So again, lining those very neatly up in the corner. The line needs to run from here to here, intersecting the piece that you've just sewn. And I'm going to do that in both corners. So I'm going to return to the sewing machine and sew on top of the drawn line. So I'm going to remove the pins, and again I'm going to cut a 1/4 inch away from that drawn line, or that sewn line. So I'm going to line the ruler up with the 1/4 inch line on top of the line just sewn, and then cut the excess fabric. And again, I'm going to press those seams. I'm going to set the seams and then press towards the small triangles. So I've laid all the pieces out in the block layout, and I'm going to start by making the 4 patches in the corners. So I'm going to take these to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to set the seam and press towards the background square. So I'm going to lay them back out. And now I'm going to join these together in pairs. So because the seams were pressed in opposite directions, they should butt together. So I'm going to take those back over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. And so now I'm going to press these seams open. So I've returned the pieces to the block layout, and now I'm going to sew together the flying geese. So I'm going to sew those with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to press these with the seam going away from the point. So with all the pieces back in block layout, I'm now going to sew them together in column order. I'm going to use the positioning point technique to get perfect points, and you can right click on the link above and it will take you to my video on how to get perfect points. So I'm going to take those over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. I'm now going to set the seams and press them open. I'm going to return these to block layout. And now I can attach the bottom pieces to the columns. So I'm going to take those over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. And I'm going to set the seams and press them open. And now I'm going to pin and sew the columns together. So I'm going to go back over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. And I'm going to set the seam and press the seam open. And now I'm going to pin and sew the last column. So I'm going to set the seam and then press it open. Congratulations! You have made the Salem Star quilt block.